Okay, so thank you for joining us this afternoon for the History and Future of Floodplain Maps. This is a new course that we have put together to cover where mapping is going in the future. So I am Cheyenne. I'm the NFIP specialist with KDA, so I am on the rules and regulation side of things, and I will let the other teammates introduce themselves.
Hey, good afternoon. This is Tara Lansroth. I'm the state NFIP coordinator.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Joanna Rolfe. I'm the floodplain mapping coordinator. And Bill will introduce himself, but I did want to note Patrick Bonine, he's not on the call, but he's also part of the team.
And I'm Bill Pace. I'm the floodplain mapping specialist with KDA.
So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the NFIP and then mapping in the past and how it's changed over time. And then I'll turn things over to my teammates to go over the Kansas CTP program, the regulatory products, the non-regulatory flood risk products, and then future changes as far as FEMA and Kansas. So the National Flood Insurance Program was established by the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. And so this is a voluntary program that communities can choose to participate in by enacting land control measures. So there are special regulations that apply only to floodplain, and the program provides federally subsidized flood insurance that is made available to all citizens in a participating community. And so this program was established because prior to 1968, the sole relief available to disaster victims was limited to special disaster loans. And this was in a time where flood control projects were favored, such as dams and levees, whereas now we try to work with the floodplain instead of trying to control it or limit it. And so in 1972, Hurricane Agnes pretty badly devastated the eastern coast. So this is a hurricane that made landfall a couple of different times. There were some spin-off tornadoes and caused a lot of damage. And as it turned out, not many people at this point in time had taken advantage of the National Flood Insurance Program by purchasing a policy. And so this was a very costly disaster for the federal government. And so after this, in 1973, they started requiring the mandatory purchase requirement. And so if you lived in a floodplain with a federally backed mortgage in a participating community, you are required to purchase a policy. And so in addition to that, people were at the time, seeing hurricane warnings, and they would go out and buy a policy and then make a claim, and then after that cancel the policy. So there's also typically a 30-day waiting period, except for certain circumstances, before it becomes effective. And then there are rules about how you can cancel a policy. So they have put in some rules and regulations about having a policy. And so why do we regulate the floodplain? There are several reasons why this is important. To protect people and property. So we want to reduce flood losses in Kansas specifically here. But we want to keep people safe, keep new construction safe. And so we are holding people accountable for what they want to build in the floodplain. To save tax dollars, to avoid liability and lawsuits. So if a government, like a city government, chooses not to participate in the program, they could be held liable in the future for not enacting land control for their floodplains and not taking responsibility for it. We have to remember first responders' safety, as they might have to do water rescues for people that are in the floodplain and become trapped or flooded. So they could potentially lose their lives in water rescues. And so we want to make Kansas more resilient, basically. And so these regulations, again, only apply to the regulatory floodplain or any other areas that have been adopted as floodplain by the community. So basically, we are protecting the health, safety, and general welfare of the public in that community. And those exact words are in all of our planning documents, and it's in everyone's ordinances. And it's basically a compromise for being allowed to develop in the floodplain. Yes, you can do it, but you need to do it in a way that is responsible. So these regulations are found in the floodplain management ordinance. So this is the set of regulations that are adopted by the community to regulate the floodplain. And it's usually a standalone ordinance, or it could be incorporated into the zoning ordinance or other areas of the city code. But this is a special set of regulations that, again, only apply to the floodplain, and it has the specific construction standards for floodplain development. And so I have put here the first part of the specific standards. So this is kind of the heart and soul of the ordinance. The main thing here is that residential and non-residential new structures are elevated a minimum so that the lowest floor is at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So this is a statewide standard. The FEMA minimum is 2 or above the base flood elevation, but we require at least 1 foot above. And so that is the minimum. A community could adopt a higher freeboard than that. And so there are, of course, other standards that go in the ordinance for non-structural development, RVs if they're on site for longer than 180 days. Agricultural and accessory structures will have special sets of regulations and exemptions from being elevated potentially. Like I said, a higher freeboard or other optional standards that are higher than the basic minimums can be adopted. How permitting works, what information you need to include to get your permit approved, the variance procedures, violations enforcement, also who is the floodplain administrator for that community, the statutory authorization, disclaimer of liability, and many other things that are important to have in there. So any change needs to have a permit, no matter what it is. So development is defined as any man-made change. So anything you do in the floodplain is supposed to have its own floodplain development permit. So that means, of course, new buildings, but also additions or even rehabilitations on the interior to an existing building, because it could be a substantial improvement. Manufactured homes, new driveways, slabs, subdivisions, even temporary structures need to have a permit. Agricultural buildings, again, RVs if they're there for more than 6 months, roads, bridges, and culverts, so these larger projects as well, filling, grading, excavation, any alteration to a stream channel, and that kind of work is often going to need a state and federal permit as well. And then FEMA might have to remap that area if you change it significantly. So a lot of people miss the fact that all of that development needs permits. And so where these regulations apply and where we have to get permits depends on our map that tells us where our areas of flood risk are. So in the early 70s into the early 80s, the program was under HUD, or the Housing and Urban Development Department, which was switched over to FEMA in the early 80s. And so they started the initial mapping efforts that were meant to be temporary interim maps. They're called flood hazard boundary maps, and they're very basic, non-detailed studies. So the intention was to go back and remap everything, but remapping is expensive and time consuming. So a lot of communities ended up not having a map, or they still have these effective, very old, outdated maps. Afterwards, there is the flood boundary floodway map, which is 2 separate maps, one showing the fringe and one showing the floodway. And I'll show you a couple of examples of this, but you'll see why that was causing a lot of issues. And so they changed that mapping style to the FIRM, or the flood insurance rate map. So these were paper maps where at least all of the data was consolidated on one map, but they weren't as easy to use. They are paper-based. And so after 1999, as we get into the digital age, we started producing D-firms, or digital firms. And so this is the same type of information that you would have on the older paper maps, but it's digital, so it's easier to access and update. And then in 2009, FEMA launched Risk Map, which is Mapping, Assessment, and Planning. That was a new mapping initiative to produce maps, data sets, analysis, and communication tools. And then now, as we're getting further beyond that, we have Future of Flood Risk Data, or FFRD, which is the new FEMA initiative to shift from binary to graduated risk analysis, create an appropriate role for all stakeholders, and increase access to flood hazard data, modernize management and delivery of mapping as well. So trying to be more comprehensive here. And so just quickly, I will show you a couple of these older maps that I mentioned. So again, the flood hazard boundary maps, back when the program was under HUD, it had some very simplified backgrounds and then just basic map features. So no detailed studies, no floodways. It might have contours on it, but no elevation. So here is an example of that. So you can see it's just very simplistic in style. And then, as I mentioned, the flood boundary and floodway map. So at this point in time, they were doing community-wide maps, whereas now we've shifted to county-wide maps, which is more holistic to look at the entirety of the floodplain and how it relates, because the floodplain doesn't stop at the corporate boundaries. But you can see on the left, the floodway map, you can see it inside the fringe, and then on the right side is just the fringe. And so the floodway on these maps looks exactly the same as the areas without any floodplain. So people were confused by these. If you look at just one map, you might miss where the floodway is. And so people were building unrestricted in the floodway. And that was obviously causing a lot of issues, and this is confusing. I'm not really sure what the logic was behind such a mapped system, which is why we moved into the firms after 1986. And so you can see the floodway on these maps is at least crosshatched. It's very clear where those areas are, in addition to the fringe. And so again, all of the information is consolidated onto one document, but at this point it was still community-wide. So this one is for Pittsburgh, Kansas. And again, we do county-wide maps now. So again, this is an improvement for sure, but still a bit outdated. And so then we have digital maps, which are much easier to use and access and update. And then moving into what we have now, which are still digital firms, but we do have some additional information on them. So it's not just the 100-year floodplain. You can see on this one, it has the 500-year floodplain. And so the one on the left is from the National Flood Hazard Layer, which is the FEMA GIS platform where you can find all of the effective products. And so this is kind of where we are now, and I will turn things over to Joanna to continue with the Kansas CTP program.
Thanks, Cheyenne. I guess I might try and request control if I can figure out how to do that, so we don't have to. Yeah, I guess maybe it won't let me do that. All right. I'll let you know if we need to move on and it's not obvious. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is how mapping has been done in Kansas. So prior to the CTP program, which is what I managed, the CTP grant, the Cooperating Technical Partner Grant with FEMA. FEMA did the mapping without the cooperating technical local CTP partners. And those initial D firms that were kicked off with in 1999, I think probably the first ones were seen in about 2003, 2004, were just straight digital conversions of those paper maps. And that was not a very popular choice because there was a lot of, you know, they weren't perfectly rectified. They didn't necessarily, they would have like stretches in weird places, or features were gone that were there before to be able to rectify those maps. So if they with the map modernization program, they started doing new modeling for at least zone A's, and then did redelineation on new topography for the zone AEs. And some of those earlier mapping efforts by the CTP program were doing those type of projects. So KDA became a CTP in 1999. That's when the program started. So we've been a CTP basically since the beginning. And at that time, there was about 52% of the counties had flood maps in Kansas. We didn't have a status map from when we first started the CTP program, but I think this one from 2005 is pretty reflective of where the program was at the time. And still to this day, some of these 1970s and 1980s maps are the effective maps that we're still trying to get replaced. And we're going to talk about some of those programs or some of those initiatives. And here is our current mapping status. So we have filled in quite a few of those blanks, some of those counties in the eastern part of the state that didn't have flood maps before. And we are working our way west. All these counties in green or dark blue are under development. Some of those initial DFIRMs that were done on a coarser topography were redone more recently, and that's what some of those redevelopment are. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so for the next few slides, we're going to talk about some of the mapping changes. So I kind of alluded to this already, but a lot of these older maps, either initial DFIRMs, the ones that are based on paper, were done on these 10-meter DEMs. They were from USGS topo maps. There, in some cases, might be 30 meters, but I think 10 meters is the norm for most of them. And as you can see, there's quite a bit difference in the level of detail between a 10-meter DEM and a LiDAR map, which is what we use now. And we have statewide LiDAR data available. So we use that for all of our mapping projects. And we've been using LiDAR map data since probably about 2009 at least. And some predate that, but for any new projects since 2009 at least, we've been using LiDAR data as the topography. And so this is a map showing the status of LiDAR mapping, floodplain maps using LiDAR data. So we have quite a few in progress. All that cross-hatching ones are ones that are in development. All the darker green colors are the ones that are effective and have LiDAR-based maps. And again, we're working our way west. Thanks. Okay, and so another change that has occurred over time is hydrology. So a lot of the older maps will be based on this outdated hydrology. The rainfall data would be from the most likely from the TP technical paper number 40. Regression equations have been updated periodically over time. Even gauge data will have more years of record typically. I think that's a little bit of a mixed bag because there might be gauges that were retired, but there also are some new bulletins out there too that have been updated. And even model-based hydrology has been updated. So older models are likely based on HEC1 or some other older software, whereas new ones are going to be using HEC HMS or the 2D HEC-RAS or 2D modeling of some sort. And the rainfall data now is going to be based off that Atlas 14. And for hydraulics, there have been enhancements done here as well. So older maps are going to be based on some of those older hydraulic models. In the upper right, you can see an output of a HEC2 model. And I know it's small there, but if I blew it up, you still would not be able to read it. At least a lot of it. It's, you know, we rely on a scanned output and we don't have the original modeling software for most of it. Every once in a while, we can find a HEC2 model, but usually we have to rely on the quality of the scanned output for those results. And then the cross sections and so newer data is going to be based using typically HEC-RAS. There are some other modeling softwares we'll see, like especially for stormwater systems, but HEC-RAS is the free software produced by the Corps of Engineers, and that's what we use on most of our projects. And the upper left hand is a kind of cross section from a HEC-RAS model. Another change that you'll see between older maps and newer maps is zone AEs are going to typically be on that older datum and NGVD 29, so we have to apply a datum conversion, and the latest will be on this latest datum, NAVD 88. And I don't know that there's plans like FEMA has considered how the newest datum that's coming, the 2022 one that's coming into effect, I think in 2025, it's going to impact our maps, but I assume we'll start using that on our mapping in the future, but we don't really have details on that. And then I did want to mention that a lot of those digital conversion maps or paper maps with zone A's on them may not actually be even model backed. Some of them may just be like topography based zone A's. We don't usually have a lot of details on them, but they just may not actually even have a model backing them. So, okay, we can go on. We'll talk a little more about the modeling. So right now we still use 1D modeling, where we have quite a few projects in place that are using both 1D and 2D modeling. And these models look at cross sections across the topography and flow in a single direction. So the earlier models, before we had the topography or the LiDAR topography, used this HEC-RAS software. There's been new releases and stuff, but we've been using HEC-RAS for a while for the hydraulics, but anymore, we're always going to have them based on the topography, LiDAR topography. And I guess a difference between like a zone A model and a zone AE model would be that a zone A model likely won't have any of the structure information like bridges and culverts, but a zone AE model will have that information in there. And we can go on to the 2D modeling. And so we have started using 2D modeling a lot more. 2D modeling is becoming the norm, or becoming a lot more popular within the FEMA world. It allows for flows to go in multiple directions. Rather than cross sections across the topography, it has this mesh grid that looks at the flood risk across the whole watershed and how it flows through the watershed. And so they're more watershed based models rather than just along a stream reach. And they can handle the more complex flows, and they're also using that higher quality terrain, and that land cover data is also important to these 2D models. So here's a graphic kind of showing the difference between the two models. I think you might need to click again for the rest of it to come up. Yeah. So you probably all seen this kind of watershed type model before, but like in the 1D world, it's just very focused on this, the riverine stretch. And you can see that in that left-hand image where it's looking at the fluvial flooding only, and it's only to a certain steady extent. And it's very event specific to certain event analysis. And then with that 2D model, we actually can look at both the fluvial and pluvial flooding. So that pluvial flooding would be the rainfall flooding, rainfall induced flooding, and localized flooding. And it has that data for the entire watershed. And it can lead to more probabilistic analysis. So we're not we can look at a lot of different types of analysis, much simpler in a 2D model than in a 1D model. And here's just a comparison of the results between a 1D and a 2D model. Both of these are LiDAR based models, but as you can see in between the two, there's some differences. In the left-hand image, there's a lot of floodplain in the northwest part of the city, but in the 2D model on the right, you can see that a lot of that flow is actually going through the streets and reducing some of that flooding up in that northwest part, but showing that's actually coming through the city more, and it shows a little bit different risk. And in general, I think more accurate, because I think, we all know we see that flooding going through the streets and going in multiple directions, trying to get to that lowest point as water does. Okay, we can go to the next one. So talked a little bit about the 2D modeling, but I want to focus a little more on what our 2D initiative is for the state. Since we had that statewide LiDAR available, we have taken on providing flood risk data across the state using these 2D models. They allow for us to model larger areas. So we actually combined multiple HUC 8 areas into a project area to model these watersheds using 2D modeling. And so all that area out in Western Kansas, for example, that we haven't had a lot of flood risk information, we now are starting to have that through some of this 2D initiative. And so that allows us to have a more holistic approach across the state and be able to update our maps going forward. So I'll talk about that a little more in the next couple slides, and we can go on to the next one. So what we start with is during the initial kind of scoping discovery process, we are doing modeling using that 2D modeling software, and it's called base level engineering at that point. So during that discovery phase, we are reaching out to communities and providing the data and having discussion about the what the flood risk is, what the next steps are. So it's non-regulatory at that point, but a lot of times what we're doing is taking it on to the next phase to update the regulatory maps. So we're going from a discussion point so you can see what the flood risk is, see how that impacts your community before we move on to that next phase. For those areas that don't participate in the NFIP, that haven't considered it before, this gives a good information on, okay, this is how it impacts my community, and maybe you can make a more informed decision. And then it can also be used for emergency management purposes, planning purposes, and all sorts of things like that. So once we decide to move into a regulatory product with it, we take those models performed during the BLE phase, during that discovery phase. And we enhanced them into a zone A. And basically what we just tend to do is look at, what updates have occurred since that initial modeling was done. Because Kansas was a pretty early adopter of trying to use this 2D modeling to look at this flood risk in the areas that we didn't have any information or didn't have very good information, at least. There are like new versions of HECRAS that have come out that we had to try and accommodate for some of it, the downfalls of it before, that now are part of the software. We've also had new topo, new LiDAR flights come out since we performed some of that BLE. So those are the type of enhancements that we are doing before going into the regulatory, or while creating the regulatory maps. And the latest initiative is to create Zone A-E with floodway maps. So initially we continued just using 1D models for the Zone A-E with floodway studies, but we are moving forward with 2D floodways. We have several projects in progress right now that are going to have 2D floodways on their regulatory maps. We haven't pushed any out to communities yet. We're not quite at that stage, but we're trying to follow the latest guidance. It's a bit of a big shift for FEMA. So we're staying in the mix on the guidance and trying to make sure that we end up with a product that works for communities to manage. And so kind of talked about this a little bit already, but and I don't want to go into too much detail because 2D floodways are probably worth a whole another hour of discussion, and we also don't have all of the answers. But if you look at these images, this is the same area, and on the right hand side is a 1D floodway. So a floodway created in a 1D model, and then on the left is a floodway created in a 2D model, and you can see the differences. There are some increase in the size, but not in every location. So if you look near that confluence, it's actually not quite as large, but then you see how the flow splits off and goes around the road on the left, whereas on the right hand side, it's not going on the other side of the road. So because the 1D models wouldn't handle that. So that's a difference. That's a typical type difference we might see with these 2D floodways, that they tend to be a little bigger because they're unsteady state flow. But we will provide updates as they come available, and more guidance and how it impacts local floodplain managers on how they can use this data. Essentially, like the cross sections are getting replaced by BFE evaluation lines. So they're more contoured and not like these straight lines that cross sections are in a 1D model. I think that's all for that slide. And then I would just wanted to highlight a cool tool that comes out of these 2D models, is that animations become an option. So you can see how the flooding starts and where it starts to come in first and how it recedes. And you can do this at different time steps. I think this is a fairly large time set, but you could do smaller ones. I think this might be a 15-minute time step to look at the flood coming in, but we just think that's a pretty useful tool that can come out of these 2D models. Okay, and so here's the current status of our 2D modeling. So all these areas in light blue, we have 2D models for. The areas in dark blue, we were very close. In fact, I think Pawnee Walnut is going to have that out to communities within the next week or so. And the other three in the western part of the state are going to be within the next month or two. Upper Solomon's Lee might be a little bit past that, but we're very close on these ones. In yellow for the Low Smoky Hill, that's kind of earlier in the phase. We're just kind of getting that kicked off. So that would be one of the last areas that we have 2D modeling to do. And then in the eastern part of the state, Wyandotte County is one that we're looking at doing for our FY23 update CTP projects, which are in progress of being finalized. Our grant documents are in review right now. And Johnson County is their own CTP. They're doing 2D modeling work, but they're in control of that. So I just note that as differently. And then Donovan County is one that is a FEMA project, but it is mostly 2D as well, except for I think the Missouri River is the only thing that's not 2D for Donovan, which is also in progress project. Okay, so I'm going to hand this over to Bill now and get to talk about flood risk products.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. So with these newer studies and more advanced modeling efforts, the outputs are more than just the regulatory products you'll see, like on the firm. So the 1% annual chance of the 100-year floodplain or the 500-year floodplain. So here we have these non-regulatory flood risk products, and so this provides additional flood risk information, so you can get water surface elevations for different recurrence intervals studied. So the 0.2%, the 1%, 1% plus 2%, 4%, and the 10% annual chance. And so all those recurrence intervals are in the if you look at the FIS and for the Zone E floodplains, you'll see those flood profiles in the back. In addition, there's also the percent annual chance grid, which gives basically a probability of a particular location experiencing a flood in any given year. And another one that's very useful is the percent 30-year annual chance, which is shows you the probability that any particular area will experience flooding in a 30-year period, which is the standard life of a typical mortgage. The image currently on the screen is the 1% annual chance depth raster. So all these flood risk products are raster based. So each individual pixel represents a value. Here in this case, it's how deep the flood waters is for, in this case, Hayes. Hayes has this floodplain running through the center of town, and this depth grid provides information where you could see like a 0 to 1 foot depth, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so you can look at here in this case intersections that have deep flooding that would require road closures. You can go to the next slide. And here is the 1% or the 100-year water surface elevation. So this is the actual base flood. And so here, if you're a community and you need a large area that you need calculated for different structures, here this raster bakes product allows you to find the highest base flood elevation within this raster data set. So you can either use that for planning or get an idea of like how high you need to elevate in certain areas. You can go to the next slide. And so here's the percent 30-year chance raster. And so here, each pixel is a probability that any particular area will experience flooding within a 30-year period. As I said earlier, is the lifetime of a mortgage, and so typically with based on this statistical, statistics based. But any structure located in the special flood hazard area or the 100-year floodplain has about a 26% chance of experiencing flooding within the lifetime of their mortgage. And so having this grid available allows communities to kind of ID areas where that high chance of flooding within a 30-year period can be either avoided, or if you need to develop extra floodplain regulation measures to kind of like reduce the flooding risk. It's a good source of information for communities when they're planning future development. You can go to the next slide. So here's the actual flood risk products available. Currently, the communities in green are the areas that we currently now have these flood risk products available. With the ongoing studies that we have, more counties will have this flood risk products in the future. And since this data is becoming available, we are offering a pre-conference GIS training in using these flood risk products at this year's KFM. And I think we can add that link into the chat. But essentially, since these flood risk products are becoming available really quickly once these studies are complete, we want to give communities a chance to kind of learn how to manipulate the data and then also understand the information. Next slide. And so these flood risk grids or flood risk products are very useful for us because we currently partner with DASC to have the BFE portal available for anybody within the state to request flood risk or base flood elevations for Zone A floodplains in Kansas. And so having that grid data or raster data and then uploading that to the map will allow requesters in the future to have a automatic calculation of a base flood elevation for a user drawn polygon. You can continue to the next slide. With the base flood elevation portal, we have different categories or different requests to add. So whether it's for a LOMA application, elevation certificate, if you just want information, if you just need LiDAR ground elevation. And recently, within the last several years, we created a function to request models because of ongoing mapping projects, either through enhancement of the drainage networks in a county or city, or if you're putting in a bridge, you probably need the effective models to kind of make sure that you're not improving the floodplain by causing an increase in base flood elevations, or if you need it to file for a letter of map change or map revision, I should say. And so we've contracted with one of our contractors, Atkins, to develop a model download system for users to simply click on a stream network in Kansas and download the effective model. Atkins has experience with this. They've created a downloadable model download system for the state of Georgia. And so this is what you see currently on the screen here with all the functionality. You can search by community, and then once you find a stream, you click it, and then the all the necessary information is downloaded, like reach ID, the stream name, what zone it is, the description, and link to download it. One good functionality of it is that you can also look at structure-based risk. And if you move on to the next slide, Here, if you, instead of switching from downloading the model to looking at flood-based risk, this Georgia tool also had the ability to look at the structures through the use of building footprints to kind of get what the what their flood risk asks for structures, for individual structures. And so with our contract with Atkins, we're hoping to also include building footprints into the mounted download system to show structure-based risk within Kansas. And I think that's it for my slides.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I see Tara did put that registration for the class for at KFM in the comments. I don't think we are anywhere close to full with it right now. So if you're interested, please do sign up. So the last little bit, we're going to talk about what's coming up. And so I kind of chose that Back to the Future image there for the future changes, because we're going to talk about the future stuff, but also unlike in Back to the Future, we do need roads where we're going and we want to protect them. So that's some of what we're going to be hopefully doing with some of these products. So just to talk about some of the FEMA initiatives, right now, the future of flood risk data is the big push. FFRD is what they referred to it as. So just another acronym to add to all the acronyms out there, but it's meant to look at probabilistic as opposed to binary, and it has many modeling scenarios, and there's a lot of pilot studies going on. There's a lot of modeling to figure out what we can do with this program and what they wanted to look at, but it's still kind of in that like planning phase. It's not really, there's not likely to be any programmatic changes until the next 5 to 10 years. And then I also did want to mention the federal flood risk management standard that came out recently. It's like a standard that's reinstating one that was put in place during the Obama administration, and I think taking it up a level actually. But how that impacts mapping is there, as part of that program, as part of helping that, FEMA is creating tools on the effective data to be able to provide some of these answers that are needed for if you're getting a loan or getting a grant for critical infrastructure, for example. They're creating these rasters that have the +1, +2, +3 scenarios above that base flood elevation. I think they're also doing it for the 0.2% chance where it's not already available. And that's a much shorter turnaround. So they're just using the data that already exists, using GIS tools to create these additional products to help answer those questions for things like those grants. And so we can go to the next one. And so I'm going to talk a little more about the FFRD. And if you just keep clicking, Cheyenne, I think there's some animations on these slides. I borrowed these from FEMA and they were fancy, fancier than we usually get. But essentially the idea is that it's going to shift from a binary to a probabilistic analysis. So rather than are you in, are you out, what's your risk level? How much, what's that percent of risk? They're also looking at doing modernizing data management, delivery, and just empowering end users and stakeholders to have answers for a lot of different scenarios and better and make better informed decisions. So we can go to the next slide. A lot of the things that influence this FFRD risk rating 2.0, which Cheyenne's going to talk a little bit at the end here about. There is some NFIP objectives related to the risk, just customer and stakeholder feedback. TMAC, it stands for a technical mapping action committee, I think. And it's just it's a specialized committee that's looking at this data to provide recommendations, and then just generally technical collaborating partners, which we would be this as a CTP kind of in that group at least, and also probably the customer group. So we can go to the next one. So this is that watershed map again, and it kind of just looks at it, what they hope to provide. So right now, if you kind of look at that left watershed, it shows the map on that stream and that kind of that binary approach, that's what is the current effective delivery. And then on the right, it's looking at it more point and click and get your risk, and there's a curve related to it, which might not be in the end product, but that's going to be what's informing the decisions. Like this is your risk over a certain, a lot of different scenarios. Some more information that's non-regulatory, a lot of graduated output information, and just a lot of it's very data rich. Probably like more data than anybody wants to deal with, but right now, as I mentioned, the process is kind of in that planning phase on determining what that ultimate like deliverable and how people consume that data is going to be. We can go to the next slide. So this also talks about the outputs. So there's a lot of, these are some of those key outputs, depth, velocity grids, and then you can times those together and get this depth times velocity grid, which shows where the water is deepest and fastest, and then annual probability. So a lot of these grids are things that we already create as part of that flood risk products, but when you're creating them for a 1D environment, you're really not looking at that watershed risk. You're just looking at a very specific risk within a very specific parameters. This will be more encompassing, more comprehensive on how it's pulling that data. And this is just kind of meant to look at what it could look like for an end user. Essentially, you want to look at this area. Oh, these buildings are high risk. This one's more on the edge of low risk. This is projected damage and the impacts for it. So that's what FEMA is heading towards. And we can go. And so I just wanted to highlight some of our KDA initiatives that are aligned with that FEMA project, and also we hope providing communities with good resources and putting our communities with a good step forward into that future risk look. And so we're going to continue. We're still updating regulatory products. We're moving more west, as I mentioned, with our regulatory updates. We're using 2D modeling going forward for everything. We have some pilot projects that are ongoing or going to start soon. So we have a climate change tool for model input. So we're trying to look at how to for a tool to get the intensity, duration, and frequency inputs for a model. We're using Lawrence as the pilot area. Building footprints for 3 counties right now that are LiDAR derived, but also to pull some of those features like lowest adjacent grade into those footprints. We have a nature-based solutions project going on to look at which nature-based solutions are going to be applicable in Kansas and get more of it rather than such a high level look that is available from FEMA, and also a roadway overtopping scenarios project. And then we'll continue with some community support with technical assistance and that model download system that Bill talked about. And I see there's a question to go back one slide. I don't know if we want to do that at the end or do that right now, but
I think, yeah, okay, we can go back right now.
okay. I don't know, Mike, or Michael, if you wanted to ask a specific question or, okay, you just wanted a picture. I can send this later too. All right. And I think this is where I hand it back to Cheyenne.
Right. Okay. And so for the BLE, going back to the rules and regulations side of things, this is going to present the opportunity, most likely for individual communities that don't have maps or they're very outdated or they want to know what their flood risk is, the opportunity to join the NFIP. And so if we can provide that to them, we are hopefully going to have model language developed here soon so that it can be adopted into the ordinance as best available data, so that they would have something to regulate to, because the Code of Federal Regulations for communities without maps is very vague on how floodplains are to be designated and regulated without a map. So that obviously presents a challenge to communities. And so hopefully this will help us to overcome that hurdle for NFIP participation, and also having them be able to manage their risk better. And so for the communities that also have some of those much older, outdated maps, it can help complement those maps with better information. It's updated, it's a better product, and maybe show some additional coverage where the streams are not included on their maps. And so this coincides nicely with the new insurance system that we have, Risk Rating 2.0. And so the legacy system was basically your lowest floor level versus the base flood elevation, whereas now we have the risk rating engine where they are putting all these different data sources into that engine to generate a premium that's based on yes, the FEMA mapping, but also the replacement cost, policy and claims, but also catastrophe models and other data sets from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USGS, and other things like that. As well as like distance to the water source, the flood frequency, and all of this other information. And so this was rolled out in 2021. It was the first change to the rating system since the 1970s. And so now, of course, we're integrating all these other data sets. And so it ties into these new mapping products that we're having. And eventually FEMA is planning on changing the NFIP and the CFR and some of that, which I think is still several years away, but it's kind of coming together in the distance on the horizon, I guess. So I just wanted to tie this back into some of that side. And then I think Tara has a little bit on future conditions and equity here.
Yeah, thanks, Cheyenne. So one of the things I just wanted to mention here at the end was as part of the community assistance program, we are rated on different metrics, and we were just rated this year in 2023. And so the next time we're going to be assessed is in 2026. And they've added a couple new metrics here that deal with future conditions and equity. So one of them is going to be a measure on how well we're considering equity and assessing vulnerable populations that are disproportionately impacted by disaster. And so you can see there my little graphic I found there on the right, looking at how equality compares to equity. And so equality, you might be given the same type of resources, but you're not really taking into consideration if those are actually going to allow them to achieve the goal or to recover from a disaster. And so equity is more of a measure on not only giving them the same resources, but ensuring that those resources will get them the same result essentially, or that same level of recovery. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a strategic report that's going to look at equity and then also future conditions and how we're going to integrate using those into the future into our planning efforts and how those can fit into how we do business here at the state. And then Joanna mentioned earlier about the federal flood risk management standards. I also had just a little bit here on the end about that, about how they're going to be using stricter criteria for those federal grants. in order to plan for those future conditions and better ensure the project longevity. So looking at, and I know we're not on the coast here, but for instance, like coastal areas, they're going to look at projected sea level rise into the future. And for certain projects that receive grant funding, they're going to have to build those to those future condition standards. And so there may be some similar types of higher or stricter criteria to use here in Kansas for those grant applications, and making sure that projects are going to be, built to conditions that we expect to see in the future. So we're going to be looking at those things, and I just thought I would mention that. And that is actually our last slide. And I know we're actually at time, but there's our contact information, and we're happy to hang out here a few more minutes if there are any questions.
Also, if you want a certificate, just send me an email. We don't send them out automatically. So just send me a request and I'm happy to get that to you. Yep.
And I think, Cheyenne, you'll also be sending out a follow-up survey. This was the first time we've done this class, so we would appreciate any feedback you guys on how we can make it better or improve it for the future. So
yes.
I appreciate everybody being on today.